Hi, everybody. This is Jeff Barnett. Welcome. I know we have a few more people still to join us. I see a couple of people have commented. Elise and Teresa have written, can see and hear you. So excellent. That's a great sign. So obviously, there's only a little bit of irony if I can't manage the technology here for a webinar on use of technology in your practice. So thank you for everyone who's typing in your comments. I can, whenever I look down, it's that I'm looking at the control panel here and can see your comments, so that's great. Let's see. Oh, also just to let you know, you should be able to see the PowerPoint, and you can also download it. There's a PowerPoint that's on the dashboard for you, and there's also an additional article for your use later. But everyone should have access to the PowerPoint. So if for some reason you don't see the PowerPoint, certainly let me know. So hopefully everyone's able to see and hear me. Everyone has the PowerPoint, and I want to welcome you all. Again, I'm Jeff Barnett, and we'll go ahead and get started. In terms of using the dashboard, again, if you have questions as we go on, please feel free to type them in, and I'll be monitoring this as I'm speaking, and hopefully can respond to as many of them as would be possible. And it looks like we'll have a few more people joining us, but hopefully we can go ahead and just get started. So the goal of this webinar is to talk about different technologies, how they're relevant to our work as practicing mental health professionals, as clinicians, how to interact with clients using social media, what are the different ways different technologies might be appropriately integrated into our clinical work. And let me just move forward here. So I just want to disclose that any information I'm sharing is just my own comments. As you may have read in my bio, so I'm a past chair of the APA Ethics Committee, the Ethics Committee of the American Board of Professional Psychology, of my state association's Ethics Committee. I've been on my state licensure board. So I have those experiences, but I'm not speaking for any of these organizations. And I don't have any conflicts of interest. I will be sharing some information about some different commercial products that do exist. I'm not necessarily recommending any one over another. And I'll explain how you can find out about lots of other products and software and things like that we'll talk about that are helpful. But I don't have any business relationships with any of them, so I don't have any vested interest in recommending one over another. So when we talk about telehealth or e-therapy, telemental health, all these terms mean the same thing. Basically, our focus today is on integrating different technologies into your practice. And if you're providing mental health services using a different technology or a medium of technology, then it's telehealth. But that could be telecounseling, telemental health, e-health, it's all the same. And one of the things we'll look at is just how technology has impacted how we provide professional services. And as I'll highlight, this is broken down into both administrative uses of different technologies as well as clinical uses. And obviously the clinical will be the most relevant when it comes to clients, but even the administrative uses of technologies are relevant. And so we want to be able to practice ethically, legally, and in a clinically effective manner. And it's impossible these days to not interact with technology from our own side as well as with regard to clients. That we live in a world where clients live using technology. I'm sure you can all relate to, clients having their cell phones go off during a session, or it's buzzing and then they start texting someone. And it's like, well, do I need to have a electronic device policy now in my practice so that we all turn everything off? Shouldn't that go without saying? Or, how do you interact with clients in between sessions? And we'll talk about a lot of the types of challenges and issues that can come up. And even something as basic as when, using social media now, what happens if a client sends you a friend request? I always ask, well, if it hasn't happened to you yet, it probably will if you participate in social media. But should you have a policy, a social media policy? And that's something we'll talk about, and I'll provide access to some good examples or samples you can actually use. And just how should that even be addressed in your informed consent? Should you actually integrate discussion of use of technology in your informed consent documents and discussions or agreements with all clients? Even if you're not providing telehealth, you're not providing actual clinical services over the internet, but should you still address certain uses of technology and how they might impact the relationship you have with your client and the services you provide? So for some people, this might be like, oh yeah, I deal with this all the time. But for others, it's sort of this brave new world of technology. And when you have clients who are establishing relationships, maintaining relationships, communicating, sharing information, all over the internet and using different kinds of social media and apps, it's kind of hard for us to not have involvement in that to some extent. So how we do that will be a big part of what we focus on. So when we think in terms of different technologies that we might integrate into practice, these are some of the basic ones, and there's a range here, obviously. So telephone is very, very basic, but it is a form of technology, and we all use telephones. And they can be used for administrative purposes, and they can be used for clinical purposes. So if you've ever had a client who calls and leaves a message for you, in between scheduled appointments, saying, I'm in crisis, or I have a question for you, or, I need to talk to you, I'm assuming you have to respond by telephone. And if you do, you might be providing a clinical service over the phone. And that's fine. That's normal. It's not a problem necessarily. We'll talk a little bit later about legal issues. What if your client is away on vacation and they're in another state? And is it now a different situation? Are you able to provide telephone crisis intervention counseling with a client across state lines, or even national lines for that matter? So we'll be talking more about that. But a lot of these forms of technology are ubiquitous. They're part of our everyday lives. And we'll talk about, the use of cell phones, of email, text messaging, video conferencing. The most commonly known one is Skype, but there's many different platforms. The platform we're using for this webinar is GoToWebinar. Well, that's part of a company that has GoToMeeting, which is a online audio video conferencing platform. And there's loads of them that exist. And then the use of social media and apps will be something we'll talk about as well. And the other article that, in addition to the PowerPoint that I posted, is, I think, a really interesting article about different apps and kind of critiquing and reviewing some of the more widely known and available behavioral health types of apps. There's so many that exist, and we have to be good consumers of them, and to have some sort of ratings and evaluation and critique of them. What are their strengths, limitations? How might I use them in practice? It's great to have other people do that work and then make that available to us, because otherwise, how would I know if it's going to be useful or helpful or not, or maybe even problematic? So as I've highlighted, there's administrative uses and clinical uses for technologies. And so we all do both of these to some extent. It's really just a question of how we do them, and, are we considering both clinical, ethical, and legal issues. And so for administrative uses, if someone wants to schedule an appointment, that's an administrative task. If I need to fax a report of an evaluation to a client's school or to their physician, that's administrative. You know, those types of things are not clinical. Clinical, I'm speaking of actually providing a clinical service. So I wouldn't necessarily be providing a clinical service using a fax machine, but certainly one could do so by email or text. And if any of you have had clients send you emails in between appointments with clinically related questions, that raises some issues ethically, legally, and clinically that we'll talk about. And the same is with text messaging. They can be used appropriately. They also can be misused or misapplied. So these will all be talked about in detail as we go through the webinar. And then each of these can be used in our personal lives. And so often in ethics, it's talked about sort of this line of demarcation or this boundary between the personal and the professional. And, so your licensure law only really is relevant to your conduct in your professional role. But the personal bleeds over. It affects the professional. And if I have a lot of stress in my personal life, it's going to impact me in my professional role. And so if I'm going through a terrible breakup in a relationship and I've lost my home, my mortgage has been foreclosed, and if a family member is in hospice care, I'm pretty confident that's going to affect me professionally. And what happens in my professional role is going to affect me in my personal life. So if I have a client attempt suicide or commit suicide or other stressors in my professional role, that can affect me personally as well. And so as we talk about the use of technology, you can say, well, I only use social media in my personal life. I don't use it in my professional. Clients will still find you. They know they're good at it. Many of them are very, very good at this. And they can find us, our online presence, and they can access information about us. And we'll talk about privacy settings, different kinds of controls we might use, how to think through if we want to have an online presence and what type, whether it's in our personal life or in our professional roles, and even just how to respond to these kinds of issues when they arise. And for me, with most ethics issues, prevention is always better than trying to mop up a mess after something's already happened. So a lot of the focus here will be on just what can we do to try to think ahead, anticipate, and hopefully prevent some of the challenges. And so we'll look at ethics issues, legal issues, and the different kinds of challenges and concerns that arise when involved in technology in our practices. So this is just an early definition of telehealth. And again, it just talks about utilizing some form of technology or telecommunications to provide a service. The reason I know it's an older reference, but the reason I share it is because it highlights it's the whole range of our professional roles and the whole range of the professional services we provide. So I know of colleagues who have an international online supervision group, peer supervision group, where they have the ability through the software to upload digitally videos of sessions, and it's all password protected. And then the colleagues in different countries can log on at the appointed time. They can pick certain spots in a video, play a little snippet of it, and all discuss it and give each other feedback. And so this is an international peer supervision group with the ability to upload the video recordings of sessions digitally. And you could do supervision of supervision in the same way. So this could be done for consultation, supervision, assessment, treatment, any professional service that we provide. And all mental health professions ethics codes make it very clear that the ethics code applies to the full range of services we provide, no matter what role it is. If it's a professional role and you're operating as a mental health professional, the ethics standards apply. And so, this is just, we're talking today primarily about the provision of direct clinical services, so more of assessment and treatment, and using different technologies for doing that. So there are some concerns that can arise when using different technology. And So one thing, for example, would be is if you're using email or texting as the means of communicating with a client and comparing that to an audio video communication, so video conferencing technology, where today in video conferencing technology, well, you're seeing and hearing me right now. That's an example of it. And we could easily do that with clients, and that's used fairly widely now. That's very different than when you don't have the visual cues and auditory cues and the ability to hear and see the person. There are some benefits to using email and texting in some controlled ways, in a limited manner, but definitely some drawbacks or limitations. And so that's the visual cues and auditory. Also the issue of, how would I handle an emergency or a crisis across a long distance? What if I have a client who's in California and I'm in Maryland? So we'll talk about some specific recommendations for how to do that. It's not impossible. And I've had personal situations where I've needed to do that. The other thing, going back to the first bullet point here, there's a difference to me between having a client who I'm primarily seeing in person or treating, interacting with in person, and we augment that with telehealth. That can be seen as a somewhat different from all interactions are over the internet. So there are some businesses where one would conduct all services from the initial contact, the informed consent, initial intake, history, mental status, developing a treatment plan, reaching an agreement on it, and then providing treatment. And it's all online. There was no in-person real contact. And again, this issue of real has to be thought about. If you're using this video conferencing technology, that's real. As an interesting example of this, so in my state, we have mandatory continuing education, and we have the ability to use consultation, peer supervision groups, consultation groups to count for some of these hours. And it can be done electronically. It doesn't have to be physically in person. And even for our CE, the continuing education courses, a certain number can be online like this. Our state board views it differently if it's asynchronous versus synchronous. So synchronous meaning it's live and interactive. You can ask questions and receive responses, whereas the asynchronous is more of it's just posted online and there's no actual live interaction. So with the live interaction, there's a lot that we're able to do. And then because people are so used to texting and emailing, sometimes it's a challenge to maintain a professional tone to interactions. If you've ever received an email, it's just like, sup, and it's probably not how we want to communicate with clients. And then there's definitely issues of privacy in maintaining confidentiality and ensuring that we have appropriate software that we're using and have appropriate safeguards in place. It's certainly much easier to control confidentiality when we're seeing someone in person in an office, as opposed to having to utilize technology and go over the internet. And so we'll talk about specific techniques and strategies, steps one can take for achieving that. And then sometimes it's even a challenge to guarantee the identity of who you're communicating with. There's an example I can share with you of a clinician who was providing services online, but it wasn't video conferencing, so it was just by email. And it's like, how do I know it's the same person each time? Do I have a mechanism, a means of ensuring that this person is the same person each time, or who they say they are? And then how do I know it's not a 13-year-old who got their parents' credit card and is paying online and is accessing this service, but they don't have the legal right to give consent? And so I'm actually violating the parents' legal rights and this young person's by providing this treatment inappropriately. So even just having a mechanism for ensuring the person's capacity to consent, legally appropriate to consent, and verifying who they are. And then the whole issue of licensure issues that I mentioned, we'll talk more about later, but the idea that I'm licensed in Maryland, can I see my client if they just go to Delaware for the weekend? And they are in crisis, or let's say they're going on vacation for 3 weeks. I don't think they're going to get a new psychologist just for 3 weeks at the beach in Delaware. But what if they want to continue their treatment with me online or over the phone? How can I do that? And we'll talk about how states are addressing that and some of the goals for how we'd like to see it addressed in the future, some of the challenges that exist. And this is for crossing state lines as well as even national borders. So the technology really opens things up dramatically for us. We can have greater access to so many more people, and they can have greater access to needed care. There are people who might not be able to access treatment if it wasn't for the availability of the telehealth services. So it's not good or bad. It's amazing, it's wonderful, and it brings with it certain challenges and risks and difficulties in addition to the opportunities. And so our goal is to address all of those throughout this webinar. So just thinking in terms of the telephone, and this could be a landline phone or a cell phone, but imagine having clients who are homebound for any reason, whether it's they don't have transportation, they have physical disabilities or other limitations, their mental health issue prevents them from leaving their home, agoraphobia, for example. Or what if someone's in a very remote area? It could be a rural or other remote area where there's data on, for each state, how many counties by state don't have a mental health professional. And in some states, you can have people living in fairly remote areas where they might have to travel 3 to 4 or more hours just to get to a session. Well, what are the odds that someone's going to drive 3 hours each way for a 50 to 60-minute session? That's just not feasible for many people. And it's certainly not feasible for us to drive 3 hours each way to do a home visit necessarily. So having telehealth, if the client has a computer with an internet connection and it has a camera on it and a microphone, that really opens things up dramatically. And the military and the VA have used telehealth for different kinds of treatment, assessment, and consultation and supervision for years. And it's, imagine being on a Navy ship out in the middle of the ocean, and you're the only mental health clinician on this ship serving 1,200 sailors and service members, and there's an issue that's outside of your competence. The ability to consult with a colleague and to actually have that colleague join in on a session with the patient's appropriate consent, and to do it all live is just done using the video conferencing technology. So it opens up lots of opportunities. For some people, anonymity can be really beneficial as well. And I know we're just talking a telephone here, which we all use, for both clinical and administrative purposes, but a lot of these points that I'm making are true for all of the technologies. And again, ease of contact between appointments during crises, the ability to just return a call and do crisis counseling. And if you needed to actually conduct an entire session. I had someone just this week who contacted me, who I see periodically, and has to drive a certain distance and has different challenges with being able to find the time and get daycare. It's not always easy to just say, come on in. And the question was, well, if we can't work this out, can we do a telephone session? And I wouldn't just impulsively say, of course. I would want to think about it. Who is this particular client? What's this person's treatment needs? Do I feel that I could still provide good treatment, provide good care over the telephone? Or does every session need to be in person? And again, to me, this is someone who I've been meeting with in person, so it's not the phone's not the only form of treatment. As I mentioned, I would view that as something a little bit different. So there's these 3 waves of technology that have been talked about, and there are those that increase our efficiency in running our office. So like having a fax machine, having telephone, having a photocopier. That's great. And those enhance the vision of clinical services. So as we've talked about, the telephone for clinical services, email, texting, video conferencing, and then those that are considered emerging technologies, things like virtual reality or augmented reality technology. They even have TV commercials now, for different smartphones that you can actually snap on to a hood that you wear that gets you into a virtual reality situation. But imagine if you have a client who has, a fear of flying or a fear of snakes or spiders, and you're doing systematic desensitization, and it's time for the in vivo portion. It can be so much easier to do it by technology than to do it in person. Now, I do know there are mental health professionals who are also pilots or who take clients to the airport and they actually go on a flight, and that takes a certain amount of time and it costs a certain amount of money. And if you have virtual reality or augmented reality technology in your practice, or your client has access to it, that's a use of technology that can be amazing. Also, in terms of emerging technologies, several years back, I had this idea that I thought, like, oh my gosh, I've just discovered or thought of this amazing technological advance. And it was, if you've ever seen in Star Wars, the original Star Wars with R2-D2, where he could project a hologram of a person, I was thinking, well, what if you have, like, you could have on your phone or on your wristwatch, you can log in and push a button, and then a hologram of your client is projected right in front of you, and your client has the same technology, and a hologram of you is projected in front of them. And I was like, this is so brilliant of me. And then someone told me, oh yeah, Bell Labs has been working on that for years. They've already have patents for it, and they're already using it. So the technology is just going to keep developing. It's going to keep moving forward. It's sort of the bottom line for me. And so one of our challenges is, remaining current, staying aware, being a good consumer of the technologies and the advancements in them, and seeing how they might enhance the clinical services that we provide and help us to run our offices more effectively. Even just like the ability to accept credit cards for payment is something that helps us run our office more efficiently. In the old days, it's like you mail a statement to your client at the end of the month, and then they would write a check and mail it to you or drop it off. And now on an iPhone, you can have a little device that snaps in. You can just slip the card through, and the charge goes through. That's an example of increasing the efficiency in running our office. So these are examples of the first wave technologies that we've mentioned, but even just like word processing, anyone who's anywhere around my age, if you remember having to type up reports or papers, like in grad school or college, typing up a paper, and what happens when you make an error, and having to, or the whole thing of when you CC someone, or BCC, it's carbon copy, where we actually had two pieces of paper with a piece of carbon paper in the middle, so it would make a carbon copy. And anytime you made a single error, you'd either have to start all over or somehow correct it. The idea of word processing, when that came out, I was like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This is so easy. And the ability to send things electronically. So I think, fax machines are sort of out now. It's just scan something and send it electronically. And then obviously we used to have answering machines. Now voicemail is more common. And then just electronic claim submission. So these are just all examples that exist. Second wave technology, things like computerized test administration, scoring and interpretation, and we've talked about using the phone. When I was in graduate school and an intern, when we did the MMPI, this personality inventory, if a person has to put true or false, we had to actually use a book and a paper and pencil, and had to fill in the circle for each item, which took a long time for them to do. And then we had all these templates you had to lay down on top of it and count all the ones that were circled and transfer them onto a sheet. It could take an hour to an hour and a half to score this test, and then you'd have to interpret it. And now a client would take the test on a laptop or on a computer in your office, and once they're done, you just click enter or a certain password first to get in, and then not only is it automatically scored, the entire thing is scored in half a second or less. It actually prints out many more scores than we used to do manually, and it interprets it. The interpretation part presents some ethical challenges. The administration and scoring electronically, that's a tremendous time savings. That's a great convenience. Because the computer can't attend to behavioral observations, it can't attend to the person's history, it can't ask questions. When you put this, what did you mean? Or is that what you intended? So all the computer can do in what they call an interpretation is really just hypotheses for us to investigate. But even having that is amazing. It's wonderful. So the idea is that we can use technology in many ways that can really enhance our ability to provide services. And then the third wave we've talked about of virtual reality, and now what they call augmented reality, which is even more advanced and more lifelike. You feel like you're actually physically there in the scene. And then we have all the interactive televideo communications, video conferencing, which enables us to have much greater reach for many, many people. So for emailing and text messaging, again, it's the same thing, administrative uses and clinical uses, to have a client text me to say, I'm in traffic, I'm stuck, I'm on my way, I should be there soon. I appreciate a client letting me know. Or by sending an email, can we make Thursday's appointment at 10 instead of 11? Those are just administrative uses. The interesting thing about email for clinical purposes is that there's no evidence to indicate that email as the primary therapeutic medium is effective. So, to answer a question, to respond, about anything administrative or a brief question is great. It's a great convenience, but it's not really found, and there's no research that's indicated that it's an appropriate replacement for in-person treatments. Whereas, as you'll hear, the video conferencing has lots of support. So in terms of ethics, as we've talked about, how we do informed consent is going to be really important, and anything addressing the technology, how it might impact the relationship, how it might impact the treatment that's provided, even how do you respond if there's a technology failure. When we meet in person, we don't have to talk about that. But when you're dealing with technology, that goes into your informed consent. And then what is confidential? So we'll talk more about the ability to ensure confidentiality and HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, and how that's relevant. And so we'll be focusing on that a little bit later. And then encryption is software that we can easily download, and there are many free, easily accessed software programs for encryption. But basically, the way it works is that when I type on my keyboard, I can see on my monitor what I'm typing. And then when I hit send, if it's encrypted, it gets scrambled. So it can't be intercepted, and others don't have access to it. The issue is your client has to have the same encryption program, the same software, and you, in essence, both log in so that your client has the software receive your email and then decrypt it. So a person who's not logged in and is not using the same software wouldn't have access to what's sent. So encryption can be very helpful for helping to ensure privacy. And then just basic computer hygiene for safety and security, things like virus, malware, and firewall protection for your computer, and as I'll emphasize again later, updating them. It can seem like such a nuisance when you get these emails when you're in the middle of doing something on your computer of, an update is available. Do you want to download this now? And you have to log out of any programs, close any programs you're in. But when it says, important security patch. That's important. You know, basically the company has Microsoft or whomever, you know, Mac, Apple, has found a flaw or a fault and has developed the patch for this gap in security. And if we don't download it, you're not secure. And so we have to keep downloading these updates whenever they do come out. And again, so an ethics issue, this is a legal issue too, is the provision of services across state lines. And right now, there's an effort to try to have what's called portability of your license. For the mental health professions, it doesn't really exist at this time. In the profession of nursing, they actually have what's called an interstate compact, where it's just like a driver's license, basically. So, I mean, I have a driver's license from Maryland, and I drove up to New York. Well, I don't have to get a New York driver's license. What I do need to do, though, is I need to be familiar with the laws in each state. And if I'm not, I might get a ticket because maybe Maryland has a right on red after a complete stop, but New York might not. And so if I'm following my Maryland laws in New York, I'm taking a chance. But it's my chance. When it comes to provision of clinical services, it's not just a chance about us or our license, it's also about our client. And so we want to ensure we're doing things both ethically and legally. So there is no interstate compact for the mental health professions right now. There are efforts working on it. The challenge is all licensure of health professionals is done on a state-by-state basis. There's no national licensure. So each state legislature decides this. There are groups, professional groups working on this, and the hope is that they'll be able to agree on the minimal standards, like the minimal licensure exam score and the minimal number of clinical supervised hours and so on, and that if all these states can agree on that, if you're licensed in one state, then you can use your license in the other state. As it works right now, if I'm in Maryland and that's where I'm licensed, I'm providing a service, a professional service in Maryland. The issue is, what if my client is now in another state? So if my client's in California or Wyoming or New York or wherever, so I'm providing the service from Maryland, but it's being received in that other state. Now, Maryland can't say anything about what's happening at that other state, but that other state certainly can. And some states' licensure boards have laws and regulations addressing this, and some haven't addressed them yet. And for those who haven't addressed it, we have to use our own judgment of, you know, well, what risk am I taking, or what might happen if I provide services across state lines. I know I'm allowed to offer the service, but if it's being received in this other state, they might be defining the service that I'm providing as practicing without a license in that jurisdiction. And I have to decide, am I comfortable taking that chance? Each state licensure board has some latitude to this and some exceptions, and the vast majority have what's called a temporary practice exemption. These were originally developed to meet the needs of forensic psychologists and forensic other mental health professionals, people who would come in to a state, evaluate someone, testify in court, and then leave and go back to their own state. And to do that, you know, you're going to be there for 10 days or a week. It's not feasible to get licensed, you know, to pay all the money and take all the time and take their state exam. And so they have this temporary licensure exemption, and typically it's just you have to apply, which is just like an email to the licensure board telling them the dates when you'll be present, what services you'll be providing, and for how long, and a copy of your license. And then typically they'll say, you know, you're granted temporary licensure in this state from this date to this date only. So that exists. The related issue is, again, if I have a client who goes away for 3 weeks on vacation and wants to have phone sessions or video conferencing sessions, if I provide them and I don't get that temporary licensure exemption, technically I am practicing without a license in that other state. I can't certainly advise anyone to do that or that it's okay to do it. I just happen to know anecdotally that many professionals do this. So for example, if I had a young adolescent whose parents were divorced, and I'm treating this young person with appropriate consent, and then that child's going to go to spend a month with the other parent in the summer in a totally different state. Is that person going to get a new psychologist or a new mental health professional for 1 month and then come back and continue with me? Is it more feasible for us to be able to do phone sessions or video conferencing sessions with appropriate consent? But it exceeds that 2-week or 1-week exemption for temporary licensure. So that's a challenge, unless I'm going to go get licensed in that other state, which is probably not feasible just because I have one client for 1 month. So I might engage in illegal practice from the perspective of that other state. There is zero case law at present for any mental health professional doing this. What it would involve would be the Attorney General of that other state. First, they have to find out about it, and that would be someone would have to file a complaint, meaning my client or their client's parent. And then they'd have to want to try to extradite me from my state to that state to take legal action. I've been told the odds of that happening are pretty low. Also, what if I have a client who's on a business trip and gets in crisis and calls me and we do a phone session? I don't have time to contact that other licensure board in writing and wait for their written response. But again, there's zero case law. There's no action yet ever taken against any mental health professional who's provided emergency care for their client across state lines. I will just highlight that that's different from the scenario of creating or joining an online counseling business, that its business model is providing services across state lines, and if you're not licensed in those states, that could be viewed differently. So again, it's up to each state licensure board. That's the best way I can explain it. The other big issue here is, and this is ethical but also a legal issue, is are you aware of legal requirements in the other jurisdiction? So if I have a client who goes away to that other state for a month and then reports to me, and my stepdad has abused me there in that other state, have I researched the mandatory reporting requirements in that jurisdiction? I mean, am I allowed to report that here in Maryland, or do I need to report that actually in the county where it allegedly is occurring? And to do that, I'd have to be familiar with those requirements in that state. And this could be for the suspicion or a report of abuse or neglect of a minor. Some states have elder abuse reporting requirements, a suspicion of abuse or neglect of an older adult. Some states don't have that. They have what's called vulnerable adult reporting requirements. So in Maryland, as an example, we have a vulnerable adult reporting requirement for a suspicion of abuse, neglect, self-neglect, or exploitation. So if you're in another state where you're licensed and you're providing treatment to someone in Maryland, you'd want to know that law, and it might be different than your law in your state where you're licensed. And then the third one is the whole issue of the Tarasoff types of issues. So some states have a duty to warn law, some have duty to protect, some have warn and protect, warn or protect. Again, Maryland, I know, has duty to warn, protect, or treat. So we're required to use treatment as the first intervention if a client makes a threat to do harm to an identifiable victim. So either if it's not feasible to treat them or if treatment's no longer effective, then we would both warn and protect, so notify the intended victim and the police. Every state's different. I was somewhat surprised to learn that in Texas, just as an example, I'm not against Texas, that's where I did my internship year, that in Texas, there is no duty to warn, protect, or treat law at all. And so if you, in good faith, try to protect a third party from harm or even death by breaching confidentiality of your client who told you what of their intent, you will have action taken against you. You have violated your state's licensure law and you violated that client's rights, even though maybe from a moral and ethical perspective, you feel you're doing the right thing. So again, not only must we know the laws in our own jurisdictions, we need to be familiar with the laws in all jurisdictions where we might be providing services. And then identity issues we've mentioned before. One way of addressing that is you can have a client, if you're using video technology, just hold up to the camera their driver's license or some other identification, and then you'll know who it is. If you're just using texting or email, you can certainly have a password that you give to your client, or a code word, for example, that they would use each time. Obviously, they could share that with someone else, but it's a step in the right direction. So we mentioned the visual and verbal or auditory cues as being so important, who the individual is. The whole issue of individual differences becomes so important, excuse me, even more so than in our typical day-to-day in-person practices, because the use of technology opens it up so much more broadly. Imagine having like a, not just national, but international access to potential clients. Well, now there's language issues and there are all sorts of cultural issues. So just because I have the technological ability to communicate with someone doesn't mean I actually have the competence to provide effective services. And so any issues of multicultural competence that are relevant when we meet with people in person are still relevant using technology. It's just that they may even be bigger issues. And then if I'm using just the telephone or just email or just texting, again, there are all sorts of individual differences that I might not be able to attend to as fully or as competently as I might like, primarily because I'm not able to observe the person or interact as I might in person. And then handling emergencies and crises we talked about before, but the idea that you have to actually plan ahead for this if you're treating people across distances. Even if it's in my same state, if someone's 5 hours away, am I familiar with the resources in their local area just in case there's an emergency so I can guide or direct them to the appropriate place? Or do I make contact with a colleague in their local area in advance? So many times people will utilize us using technology because there isn't an appropriately trained person in their area. So if someone's in a remote rural area, and let's just say they have an eating disorder and I specialize in that, they might receive treatment from me using video conferencing because they can't drive 4 hours each way or 3 hours each way. But there might be other mental health professionals, or at least health professionals, an advanced practice nurse or nurse clinician or nurse practitioner, a physician. There'll be other professionals in the local area, maybe not who are appropriate or competent enough for the ongoing treatment of their eating disorder, but competent enough to handle crises and emergencies. That not all crises can be handled over the technology. Some you need someone there in person. And so it just highlights the idea of the need to address these issues up front, to think about them, and to consider how would we want to respond to these situations if they occur. And then in terms of client expectations for responsiveness, if you've ever received an email from someone that they send at midnight, that's paragraph 7, subsection 4, this is very extensive email. Okay, number one, most people, when they send an email or a text, especially a text, expect a near instantaneous response. So I have to make sure my clients not only understand my use of technology, but my responsiveness. So do I let them know, I'm more than happy to have you send emails in between sessions, but you need to know my policy is I respond to emails within 24 hours. And if it's a crisis or emergency or requires a response in less time than that, here's what you should do. You should call my cell phone, or you should call my voicemail and leave a message and let me know. But I have clients who text me, but I make sure they understand that if you text me when I'm in session with another client, I will not respond right then, just as I would not respond to a text from a different client when I'm meeting with you. And they understand that, but again, to me, that's an informed consent issue, making sure they understand what I'm willing and able to do. Basically, to me, one of the goals of informed consent is ensuring that your clients have reasonable, realistic expectations for the services that they're agreeing to participate in. And that does include our use of technology, our responsiveness, and also the fees that we charge. So for example, if a client sends me an email and has a question and I respond to it, do I work like an attorney? Do I have a stopwatch and say, oh, that was 2.35 minutes. You owe me whatever it is, $18.12. That's not how I run my practice. But what if it's a really long email and it's going to take a very detailed, thoughtful, long response? It's going to take an hour of my time. So all I can say to you is you need to have a policy that you think out and that you address as part of informed consent. And I can just give you as an example. For me, whether it's a telephone call, an email, it doesn't matter. I started this back with the phone, but anything that I can respond to in under 5 minutes, I'm not going to charge you for. Now, again, if we want to get technical, if a client calls and says, okay, I'll call you right back, and now it's a new 5 minutes, that's not what I mean. But if someone calls once in a week and it's going to take 4 minutes of my time, I'm not going to bill them for that. But if it's going to be extensive and I can see it's going to take an hour, then I'm going to say that we need to schedule another appointment, whether it's in person or over the internet. It's still another appointment that I would bill for. So just what services do you bill for? What services are included in the price you charge? What level of responsiveness can you practice? What is reasonable and realistic for them to expect of you? These are all the kinds of things you'd want to address. And so we've talked about video conferencing. And again, whether it's in the military for people who are deployed, people who are in rural settings or other remote locales, prisons. I have a colleague, a former student of mine, who runs a community mental health clinic in a very, very rural, remote area on an island of Hawaii. And they have on each island these little, they're like mobile homes or trailers, but these little rural health clinics. And in each of them, they have a video conferencing room. And so rural residents on a different island can go in and make an appointment, go into that room, log on, and have a regularly scheduled appointment with her when she's on a different island. Everyone else on the other islands can't fly for an appointment to her, and she can't go to every other island. But people can get to these little rural health clinics, and they have these secure rooms that are soundproofed and have the appropriate technology. And prisons regularly do that, and the military regularly does that. So this is a way of increasing access to care. Now, when it's amongst all the different islands in Hawaii, it's all the same state, so we don't have to worry about licensure issues. And for the military, anything within the military counts as the same jurisdiction. So an actual military base or installation, while it's located in a state, it isn't legally in that state. It's federal property, federal land. And so the same thing is true for whether you're on a ship or whatever. So that takes away the licensure issue that we've talked about. So it can be very efficient without having to have people drive and fly and back and forth, and very cost effective. And there's a lot of research that shows the cost effectiveness. And again, it increases access to care that people might not otherwise have. So that's really amazing. That can be very helpful. And again, the video conferencing truly is superior to email and telephone. It's not to say that those can't be helpful. And as I've mentioned, I don't use email for clinical purposes. I use it for administrative. But I've used telephone for clinical, not as the sole or primary means of providing services, but to fill in when a client can't make it to an appointment. If it's a big snowstorm, do I cancel all the appointments, or do we? They're home, they have a phone, I have a phone, or they have their computer, I have mine. So again, it's something that can be helpful to provide needed care. And for people going across great distances, it's great. So if you're anywhere near my age and you remember the Jetsons, years ago, the idea of having a video conference phone was very futuristic. That's Skype. That's done every day. People do this on their iPad, or they do FaceTime on their smartphone. So it's common use now. So again, you want to be aware of any technological limitations. Confidentiality is vital. The issue of technology failures is a big one, and that's something to include in your informed consent. So if we lose our connection, you should call me at this particular telephone number. And if you have a landline phone, that's even better than a cell phone, just because you know that you don't have to worry about any challenges or difficulties getting in touch. But the one thing you don't want to have happen is you're each calling each other and both getting a busy signal. So even what would you do with a technology failure? Here's what we should do. And then even as a competence issue, being competent not just clinically to provide a service, but in the technology. You know, making sure you've done some dry runs and practiced it and can troubleshoot it. All that's important. And then obviously we've talked about responding to emergencies can certainly be a challenge, and knowing local resources and having an agreement in advance for how emergencies will be handled. And then we've mentioned the licensure issues. Again, that's only if you go across state lines or national borders, but it can be relevant. It's not something that's going to prohibit you from providing services, but it can create some challenges. And then the issue of knowledge of local laws we've talked about. We don't want to be following the law where we're licensed in our state, but we're violating the law in another state where our client is. For legal reasons, but also because if you're not following the law, that could clinically have an impact on your client, and we want to do what's best for them. And it's also important, again, to not get overly enamored with the technology, that behavioral telehealth might not be the appropriate medium for all clients and all treatment needs. And so we actually should do some kind of an initial screening to make sure this is the appropriate therapeutic medium for this particular client. So, you know, just as an example, I probably don't want to do, you know, video conferencing treatment across hundreds or thousands of miles with someone who's suicidal. I mean, I'm thinking their treatment needs are greater than what I can offer, and the likelihood of emergencies and crises are so great that I think we want to work on how to help them access care in their local area. But for many, many clients, this could be a great opportunity. So this is a little bit of an older study, but I think it's so fascinating because just in terms of this issue of, are you aware of the laws in your state? Are you aware of the laws in your client's state? Did you even inquire as to the client's location? You know, even just knowing where they're located and checking on those laws would be helpful. And then being knowledgeable and correct about what those laws are. And this idea of 50% made advance arrangements for responding to emergencies and crises. Again, that means 50% didn't. So as I've mentioned, that's vital that we include that in our informed consent and we make plans for that. And only 40% used a formal informed consent procedure prior to providing online services. That's scary. I think we want to do informed consent with each client, regardless of where they're located and regardless of the therapeutic medium or technology used. So hopefully each of you would react to this the same way and say, you know, of course I do informed consent, and of course I would address those issues. But since this was a large study that had these results, I thought it was worth sharing, just to kind of highlight these issues. So a comprehensive informed consent procedure is vital. Knowing the laws in all the jurisdictions where we're providing services is clearly very important. Not practicing outside the scope of our license. So again, if I'm not competent to provide a service in person, I'm certainly also not competent to provide that service using technology. So the technology expands my range geographically, but it doesn't expand our range in terms of scope of practice or scope of competence. We still have to have the appropriate competencies to provide those services. And every mental health profession's ethics code makes it clear that all elements of the code, all aspects of the ethics code, pertain to our professional services no matter what the medium. So telephone, email, texting, video conferencing, holographic therapy, if we were to do that. It doesn't matter what the medium is. So just because it's not in person, physically live, in the same room, doesn't mean the ethics change. We still have to apply our code of ethics to the services we're providing. And some professions have much more specific guidance in their ethics code than others. So for psychologists, there's very little guidance in the current APA ethics code. The APA is currently initiating the process of revising the ethics code, and the people involved know about this issue, and we've sent them recommendations and examples of ways of addressing technology in the code that they're familiar with. The American Counseling Association, in their most recent revision, has done an amazing job. That's really the standard. They have a whole long standard on technology, email, video conferencing, social media, all that. And so even if you're not a counselor, you could just take a look at the ACA Code of Ethics. You just do an online search with Google and visit their code and see that, look at the standard on technology. It's just, even though you're not necessarily obligated to follow it if you're not a counselor, it's just good guidance. And then the APA does have telepsychology guidelines, and there are other professional organizations that have guidelines as well that are just useful for making sure we practice ethically and competently. Guidelines are just each profession's consensus statements and expert opinions on optimal practice, but they're not enforceable standards like in the ethics code or in your licensure law. And many licensure laws have not extensively addressed this issue yet, but it's coming. So it's important to pay attention to that on an ongoing basis. And then we obviously want to attend to technology as a means of protecting confidentiality. So again, virus and firewall and malware protection and so on. This is something, again, just a review, but these mandatory reporting types of requirements, most typically it's if the client's in another jurisdiction, you have to follow the jurisdiction where they're located for those laws. And then the challenge is, well, what if it's different than my law in my state, and how do I address that? And usually what's recommended is whatever's most protective of your client and your client's rights, you want to choose a higher standard. But sometimes there'll be conflicts, and then it's a question of, contact an ethics committee or licensure board for input, or if your malpractice insurance carrier has risk management specialists or consultants available, but even just consulting a colleague who's knowledgeable can be helpful. Anytime you're faced with a dilemma, I think consultation is always a good first step. And then we talked about making arrangements in their local area. Even if it's your same state, but it's miles and hours away, you still want to know about local resources and be prepared for situations that might arise. And then it is important to check with your malpractice insurance company to make sure they cover these services. I'm not suggesting they wouldn't, but I think it's good to just be sure that if I provide services over the telephone or over the internet using video conferencing, it's covered. The place where your insurance company might have an issue is if you're practicing across state lines and not licensed in that other jurisdiction. So it's important to check on that and to check before you provide the services, because you want to make sure you're covered. And then obviously making sure you're aware of limitations of the technologies you're using and making sure that they're appropriate for the individual client you have in mind. So obviously we want to make sure the services are going to be effective, and so you want to be familiar with the research, and I'll be sharing a lot of that with you. Representative research. And then, as we mentioned, assessing the appropriateness of the use of technology with a particular client, and when it's not appropriate, to make referrals. Our obligation is to help ensure each client gets the appropriate treatment. That doesn't mean we have to personally give that treatment to every client. It just means we have to try to make a reasonable, good faith effort to assist them to access that needed care. It doesn't have to be us giving the treatment, because it might not be appropriate. And that's relevant to this point as well, with practicing within your scope of practice, your areas of competence. We can expand that, but again, you'd have to make sure you're competent enough. And if you're not sure, consulting with a knowledgeable colleague who's an expert in that area is a good way to address that. And then, just as we would with in-person services, we really want to attend to all individual differences that could impact the services we provide. And so while telehealth can really open things up, it can give us access to people from other cultures who speak other languages. And we have to be thoughtful about, am I competent enough to provide treatment to this person? It's not just my technical competence, meaning your clinical competence, like assessment and treatment skills, but it's also your multicultural competence, because we can't separate that out. So how I provide psychotherapy or how I do an assessment, it's not just my knowledge and skills about that type of treatment, it's how I apply it to this individual. So the issue of diversity and individual differences has to be integrated into all that we do, and attend to that as well. And then we still have to document all the services we provide. We have to be aware of termination issues and not abandoning our clients. We have to address fees and financial arrangements. All these are usual issues, but how you do them, how they might be applied, can be a little different when you're using the technology. So as I mentioned, like fees and financial arrangements, what do you charge for, and how much, and how is that billed? How is payment made? What qualifies for, abandonment? So the client's access to us in between appointments, that has to be addressed up front, as we mentioned, for ensuring they have appropriate and reasonable, realistic expectations for responsiveness, and ensuring you have appropriate safeguards in place if they have crises. And again, I talked about there's two kinds of competence, clinical and technological, and we have to ensure we have adequate competence in both those areas. Just as clinically, we're not mandated to be the top expert in the world to provide a service, we have to meet minimal standards of competence. And if we're not sure, we should look at practice guidelines that are available and consult with colleagues who are expert in that area and get input. Well, the same is true for your technological competence. We'd want to meet the minimal standards for competence there as well, and consult, get training, and so on. And again, being aware of ethics codes, professional standards, and other guidance that's out there, different guidelines. And if it's a legal issue, I'd say consult with an attorney. If it's an ethics issue, consult with a colleague who's an expert in that area, or an ethics committee or licensure board, things like that. And then obviously participating in the development of standards is important, because this is currently unfolding as we speak. As I mentioned, state licensure boards haven't really fully addressed this across the country, and it's pretty new. And telehealth guidelines are even new. So it's all happening right now. This is just, so the APA Ethics Code, this is just the statement from the introduction and applicability section, where it mentions how the ethics code applies to all technological media. And it says, and other electronic transmissions. So if there's a new kind of transmission that doesn't exist yet, it applies. For the ACA Code of Ethics, Standard H is what I was mentioning earlier. This is just a terrific standard, even if you're not bound to follow it, just to read it through once and just have a better idea about the ethics of distance counseling, records and web maintenance, informed consent, security. And so this is the link for it. But again, you could just easily type in on an online search for Google, ACA Code of Ethics, and it'll pop right up. And then for social workers, again, it talks about social workers who provide services via electronic media, and then they give examples, should inform recipients of the limitations and risks associated with such services. So what they're saying is informed consent. And it talks about some of the precautions, how to use different technologies, protect privacy, only utilize them when appropriate. So again, I have the link for that ethics code. And then having an electronic communications policy can be really helpful. And I'll talk later about a social media policy. But this is a policy that's on the website of the APA Insurance Trust, this company called The Trust. And it's a large company that provides malpractice insurance for psychologists and other mental health professionals. It is not the only one that's out there. There are others that exist. I'm not endorsing it. But they actually have on their website different policies and documents of different sorts that are open to everyone. They're available and accessible, and they state their policy is you may download these, you can modify it for your personal use, you can just take our name off of it, put your name on it, change it slightly however you want, and use it. These are available to any professional. So you don't have to be a psychologist, and you don't have to have insurance through them. So again, I'm not endorsing it, but I'm just saying having an electronic communications policy, as we talked about earlier, making sure clients have these reasonable, realistic expectations, and making sure we've addressed all the issues we want to address. So you might just highlight things you want to make sure you include in your informed consent, or you can just utilize that form or something similar. You can do an online search and find others for sure, but it's the idea of having some kind of policy and thinking these things out in advance. That's the most important part. So actually, I was thinking that this is a good place to take our break. And then what I'll be coming up with next is a review of the literature on the uses of telehealth and effectiveness, just to give you an idea of the range of all the studies that have been done, and then look at social media, security, and recommendations. So, we've gone about an hour and 15 minutes, so we're kind of in the middle, but it's about a little after 1:10. So we'll take a 15-minute break. I will stop the recording and log off, and then a couple of minutes before we start again, I'll log back on, and then we'll begin again. And so I hope what we're covering and what we're doing is in line with what you're looking for, and I look forward to continuing in about 15 minutes. So I'm hoping people can see and hear me again. Welcome back. If you can type in a message of, here you see you. That'd be great. If I don't start seeing some, I'll have to check the technology and make sure we're doing things correctly. Great. So I just want to highlight, there have been a few questions people have typed in that I was able to look at during the break. One had to do with the issue of portability of licenses, and it's not, the reason it's not a federal issue is because each state licensure board functions under their state legislature. And so each state legislature gets to decide this. There's no federal licensure. Having served on my state licensure board, I know I've looked at the laws of other states, and I thought it was, well, we're not going to lower our score on the EPPP, or we're not going to say, you know, let's say we require 2,200 hours of supervised clinical experience for licensure, and someone else requires 1,750, are we comfortable lowering it? The bottom line is, if someone's licensed in another state, they're licensed. And so their efforts, there's an organization called the Association of State and Provincial Psychology Boards that's looking at this and working on it. But as of right now, it doesn't exist for mental health professionals. In looking at some of the other comments, I see Elise mentioned, she says, I know in PA, not all insurances cover telehealth services. And again, so that's why I mentioned contact your malpractice insurance coverage and find out whether it's across state lines or even within your state. If you're still using the technology, you want to make sure it's a covered service, because just in case something happens, you want to make sure you have that coverage. Eric raised the issue about coaching, and coaching is an interesting thing because in essence, coaching is a different profession, a different field, and coaching isn't licensed. So if you're a coach, technically you can have a lot more freedom and latitude for the services you provide, whether in person or electronically. The thing that I have learned is that if you are a licensed mental health professional, so you have your education, your supervised clinical experience, and your license in a specific mental health profession, and then you say, oh no, I'm doing coaching, that's not going to go well. But if you're not a licensed mental health professional and you get training in coaching and you advertise as a coach, in theory, one could do that. But you can't just call what you're doing coaching if you are a licensed mental health professional. So those are some issues that people have raised. The other thing is with regard to the military. Again, the military operates so that you're on the federal installation. Even if you're a civilian contractor working for the military, once you're on that military base, you're on federal land. And currently the way the military operates, it's just you have to be licensed in a state. They don't care which state it is. You just have to be licensed in a state as a social worker, as a counselor, as a psychologist, as a physician, whatever you're doing. And then as long as you're staying on federal land, so if you're at a military installation or on a ship or whatever it might be, you're practicing with that license. So it's basically the federal government through the military, Department of Defense requirement of anyone who provides clinical services, they must be licensed. And then you'd have credentialing if you're at a hospital or medical center. But the bottom line is you would have to practice within the scope of your license, but you don't have to have different licenses when you're dealing with the military. And then one, Joan raised, do I have an informed consent I can share? And actually, so on the same website that we have here on the PowerPoint right now, they have a really comprehensive and excellent informed consent document. And then I'll share with you later a social media policy. But so this website of the Trust has a lot of good documents that anyone can just access and use. So, you know, it's just a resource that's available. So I did want to share and go over with you just some of the research that's been done. And I'm not going to read each one of these to you and talk about each study in detail, but just to give you a range of the research. And I regularly get manuscripts to review, and there's just so much being done right now. So there's a lot that's being put into the use of these different technologies to provide different kinds of treatment and assessment. And a lot of the research shows that it can be highly effective. So here we have cardiac rehab monitoring, in patients with diabetes. This is more of telemetry and monitoring, but it's used in rehab psychology, telehospice. So if you can imagine, someone is homebound and normally there'd be a home visit. Well, if they have the monitor right in front of them and you're using one, you can do it virtually. You can even have support groups, group therapy that's done electronically. And then treatment of problem gamblers, treatment of depression for homebound older adults, pediatric encopresis treatment, panic disorder, different kinds of assessments that are done, treatment of ADHD, eating disorders. And again, this is not saying all eating disorder patients are amenable to video conferencing treatment. It's a very specific study, but it's finding that there are studies that are, they're investigating this and finding good results in terms of effectiveness and for pain management as well, and looking at follow-up. So this is for head injury, treatment with schizophrenia, monitoring and supporting medication use and treatment effectiveness through daily text messages of mood, symptoms, and side effect ratings. Excuse me. And there's a specific app that I'll actually go into detail with you about and share with you on this issue specifically, just to kind of use as an example of like, wow, that's kind of amazing. I can see how that would be helpful. And then just text messaging as an adjunct for CBT. So web-based treatments for different addictions, PTSD, treatment of anxiety, depression, and other symptoms of PTSD with the results, positive results over 18 months. So with 18-month follow-up on this one. And this is internet-based CBT for social phobia with a 30-month follow-up with good results. So again, I'm not trying to endorse a specific treatment or disorder or anything like that, but just to give you a range of the literature that's out there. So it's pretty far-ranging, and it's more and more being done all the time. So one recommendation is to keep up with the literature, and so if you're not sure if a treatment is appropriate for an individual. So we've talked about some of the benefits. So again, access to care is a big issue, whether it's physical access, 24/7 access, increased communication between in-person sessions, consultation and supervision, and it might not be optimal. Video conferencing might not be ideal for someone. In-person treatment might be better, but that's not always the question. Sometimes the question is, it's this or nothing, not this or gold standard. So we have to look at what options and alternatives are reasonably available. And in terms of my personal ethical decision-making model, it's always what options and alternatives are reasonably available. What are the pros and cons, risks and benefits of each of those? What does my client have to say about this? Have I consulted with a colleague and sought other input? And then you try to make your best decision. So it might not be ideal, but it might be better than any other option that's available to them. And so oftentimes we can get stuck in making decisions comparing what we're thinking of offering to the gold standard or to the ideal, and that might not be reasonable or fair. It might be more of this service that I'm considering offering versus them not getting any care at all. And so then it's a question of how can I best give this service, which might not be perfect. And if there are limitations, we'll address those through our informed consent. And then delivery of care to special populations. Even just imagine, people who are in the deaf or hard of hearing community. So I have a colleague who actually served on my licensure board with me, who is a professor at Gallaudet University, and she is fluent in sign language. And if you can just imagine, does every person who is deaf around the country have access to mental health care with someone who not only is fluent in sign language, but who is in essence fluent in deaf culture. Because as we mentioned, there's cultural issues as well, diversity issues. And so you can just imagine how people like her could be in great demand, and she could be available with video conferencing technology using sign language, providing care just as she would in person for someone who would not have access to any care otherwise, potentially. So it's just the idea that there are some people in special populations for whom this can be really valuable. And then there's a number of studies, and there's new ones coming out all the time, that are looking at the therapeutic alliance or treatment alliance using video conferencing. IATV is interactive televideo communications, but it's the video conferencing. And really a lot of these studies are finding, all the ones that I've seen, is that there's no significant difference that they can find. And in some studies, they're reporting that the ratings of alliance, based on these standardized ratings that clients do, fill out these questionnaires and rating forms at end of each session, can be superior to in-person for some people. So we need more research in this area, and more is happening, but it's kind of exciting, actually. And the research doesn't support it for use of the telephone, the internet with email or texting, but again, those can be used as adjuncts to the video conferencing or in-person treatment. So emailing, texting, and social media, social networking are widely used in our country. So, from 56% of Americans in 2001, now at 2012, 78.6%. So these are, widely used. 85% of undergraduate and graduate students own a computer. 72% of them check their email at least once a day. 82% of undergraduate students participate in social media or online social networking. And these numbers just keep going up. Text messaging is available on over 98% of all cell phones worldwide. And so that's a very easy medium to use for communication, and many people use it. Over 6 billion text messages are sent each day in the United States, with over 80% of adults texting regularly, taking up approximately 23 hours each week on average. Okay, now that just is amazing to me. And I'm thinking, there's no way I spend 23 hours a week texting. I haven't actually paid attention to that or measured it. I might be surprised. But for many people, the thing that I'd like you to keep in mind is this can be how people communicate, people in general, people who become clients of us. And if clients are used to texting in their personal lives, and that's how they communicate in relationships in general in their lives, they might want to continue that practice with their mental health professional, with us, with our clinicians. And so it's something to consider and think about. And then one American teenager sent and received 6,473 text messages in 1 month. I'm just hoping that was during the time when the parents had an unlimited texting plan. If they were charged by usage, that'd be problematic, obviously. 18 to 24-year-olds send and receive an average of 109.5 text messages a day. That's amazing. 3,200 a month. The average cell phone user in the U.S. sends 678 texts in a month. So these are just some information. And it's not that, these numbers apply to every person. These are averages, but it highlights how widely they're used. And if we use them in our personal lives, if our clients use them in our personal lives, that can affect their expectations of us and their goals and desires for communication. So in September 2014, this just shows what percent of online adults use these different forms of social media. And so Facebook, by far, is the most widely used. And this is of adults in the U.S. who are online. But Twitter is fairly widely used. Instagram, LinkedIn, there's many others that are out there. And this just gives, who uses social media. And it's, there's not like a big difference in terms of gender. The interesting thing with age 65 and older, in 2005, only 2% used social media like Facebook or MySpace, things like that. Today it's 35%. So it's going up. As young people age As people who were born into the world that use social media get older, they're going to keep using it. Whereas 20 years ago or 10 years ago, this is people who didn't grow up with that. So the numbers are just going to keep increasing. And people have more and more access. So Mood 24/7 is an app that I wanted to talk a little bit more about. And Mood 24/7 was developed excuse me, by a psychiatrist at Johns Hopkins University Medical Center in Baltimore. And if you can imagine having a client who's got a mood disorder, it could be depression, it could be bipolar, and you meet with them once a week, and you end a session saying, if anything changes, let me know. Imagine how you can both log on this website, and you each have a password, so you have access, and your client receives text messages, and it's set up so you can determine you want 1 a day or 3 a day, and when, to remind your client to submit, just text in, just quickly do a text in response, give their mood rating. So, and it gives you the scale if it's 0 to 10, and explains what the scale is. And then on the website, and it's secure, and you have to use the password you and your client have to log in, it tracks all the data and keeps track of it and has graphs and so on. And imagine how great it would be that if your client gets this text message and texts in the mood rating, and it shows a dramatic increase or decrease in a short period of time, you then automatically receive a text message alerting you to this, so you can go log on, see what the ratings are, and then you can actively follow up with your client right then, as opposed to waiting till the next appointment. So I'm not endorsing this, it's free, but it's just an app that exists. And again, it monitors your client's mood. It has their privacy policy online. Anyone can do this. They do encryption. So no one else can access your personal information. It's password protected, so only the client and their therapist can access it. But to me, that's just one example of an app that exists, but it's like, I can see how I could use that. I can see how that's something valuable or potentially helpful. Now, this is not replacing the treatment, whether it's in-person treatment or video conferencing treatment. It's not about that. This is just saying, this is something I can use with my client that enhances or augments the treatment that I provide. And this is just one example of many, many apps that are out there. And so that's why I wanted to, on the dashboard, I've uploaded not just the PowerPoint, so you all have access to that and can download it to look at later, but also one article that was done by a group of graduate students. Who better than a group of grad students to go through and try out and sample and then rate and describe all these different behavioral science apps. That's terrific. I mean, I think they're doing a great service. So I've uploaded that article, and it has, their names, and it gives them credit appropriately. But it's something that, is kind of useful. But as I've mentioned, we have to really endeavor to be good consumers of the services that are available and make sure that we're paying attention to how these are most appropriately used. Because again, something just because it exists doesn't mean it's good. And we'd want to look at their privacy policy and look at, is it encrypted and password protected, and make sure that our clients understand its use. So I don't want a client to think this is instead of treatment. This is just a means of communication in between sessions. But again, I highlight that this is something that can be helpful. So again, it's not a replacement for treatment. It's not the only good app that's out there, but it's something worth exploring. And hopefully, I share some excitement about it, just in terms of yeah, I could see how that would be useful for some clients. Clearly for some, it wouldn't be relevant at all. So social networking and social media can be very helpful in many people's lives, and many people use them in their personal lives. And so some of you may use any of these or others. I mean, I can't necessarily tell you every single social media app that exists, because some are being developed on a regular basis, and some are, excuse me, some are being dropped and no longer used. So originally it was Facebook and MySpace, and then Facebook has really taken off, and MySpace has kind of really gone down and is not really used very much. I just noticed one question. Joanna asked, do I know of any research examining the relationship between using apps such as Mood 24/7 and therapist burnout? So I think that's a really great question because, technology is so great in so many ways. But the thing we have to really pay attention to with technology is how accessible do we want to be? And how in touch and how connected would we like to be? And, so I addressed that a little bit before in terms of this issue of realistic expectations for responsiveness and all that. But even just in terms of burnout, I think we each I don't know if studies that specifically look at, using apps, but it's a great thing to look at. I can just say in general, in terms of my familiarity with the literature on burnout, there are all sorts of challenges and stresses that we have as mental health professionals. And if we're using the technology to help enhance the services we provide, that's great. But if that creates greater burdens on us, so we never can really be off, like leave it at the office, if we're always on 24/7, that's not good. That's going to contribute to burnout. And, we have to be able to set appropriate limits. We have to be able to turn it off and leave it at the office. So, in my work, where I work as an administrator and a faculty member at Loyola, I do a lot of work by email. And I'll come home, and take a break, whatever, and then go in the evening, log on again. And I might brag to my wife, I got home at 3 today. It's just, have you seen how long you've been doing emails? Do you realize that counts as work too? So just because I'm not in the office, that doesn't mean I'm not working. And the same is true. I have a private practice. And again, if I'm texting and emailing and Skyping and, keeping in constant contact with clients all the time, I don't know how good that is. And oftentimes, we're responding to a request from a client. So we're trying to be helpful. But if we're too helpful, it's actually going to be harmful to us and therefore to our clients in general. So I always feel like the topic of self-care is really what I think you're asking about. And to me, self-care is healthy self-interest. And if we don't take adequate care of ourselves, then over time, our ability to take care of others will deteriorate. So we might feel like we're helping clients by being really responsive to an email and responding right away to a text and taking phone calls in the evening. I think that's great customer service. I'm so responsive. My clients love it. But if it's up to me to set those limits and to know what my limits are, because if I'm too responsive all the time, I probably will start suffering from burnout. And that's in no one's best interest, certainly not in my clients. I know that for sure. So I think this issue of setting limits and helping clients have realistic expectations are vital. And, in terms of ethical practice, they talk about the ethics virtues, things like beneficence, helping others and doing good, non-malfeasance, avoiding harm and exploitation, fidelity, our faithfulness, our obligations, fulfilling our obligations to others, to those we serve, autonomy, promoting our clients' independent functioning of us over time, and justice, providing fair and equal care and access to care to all individuals. That's the first 5 virtues. The 6th virtue is self-care. And again, the thinking, the literature is that if you don't take adequate care of yourself, then over time, your ability to implement the other 5 virtues will deteriorate. And I think it's relevant, but just to highlight, burnout has 3 components or 3 symptoms to what is burnout. And you can all think about, have I ever experienced any of these? And I'm sure we all have. But so one component is called emotional exhaustion. So I'm sure you've experienced that to different extents at different times. The second one is what's called depersonalization, sort of like losing your empathy, losing your caring. If you find yourself, hearing a client talk, and it's like, oh man, all I ever hear is your complaints and problems. When do we get to talk about me? But that's depersonalization. And then loss of feelings of accomplishment, that it's not rewarding anymore. And I'm sure we've all experienced some of those at different times to some extent. But if you're experiencing them to a great extent or for an extended period, then that can really affect our competence. And so while we're maybe doing something positive by being really responsive and using all these apps and social media, at the same time, it's a double-edged sword, and it might actually be causing problems. So I think it's important to pay attention to this and monitor it. And then in terms of finding Mood 24/7, if you just Google it, hopefully that would show up. And another comment Jennifer has made that I just want to share is that, just as I mentioned, it's really important to use different technologies selectively and make sure they're appropriate for individual clients. So I want to make sure if I'm doing video conferencing with a client that this client is appropriate for treatment by video conferencing. The same is true for any apps we might use. And again, keeping in mind, an app is not the treatment. An app is something we use and integrate into treatment. It's something in addition to the services we're providing, but it could be helpful. I mean, if you've ever used a dysfunctional thought record for clients, in CBT, where they have to write the dysfunctional thought and then rate it and then challenge it and then the alternative thought and then take an action, the positive action, and then rate again how they're feeling. Well, that's great. Why not use an app where they can just type it in with their thumbs on their smartphone, and then it just gets saved online in the cloud in a secure location, and you can check in periodically and see it, and you can see how they're doing their homework. Now again, if you have a large practice and you're using lots of apps with lots of clients and you're having to log in to all these to monitor, that's time, your time, that you have to think about. Is that something that's included in the price that you charge? Do you have the sessions a little bit shorter? Instead of having a 50-minute appointment, you have 45, so you can have 5 minutes to log in and check in. Those are just things to think about. These are great, but I can see how these can get carried away. If you have 30 clients and logging on for each one of them, you have to factor in how you're going to manage that. So those are just some things to think about and pay attention to. So I do want to mention there's this concept of the digital native and the digital immigrant. As I mentioned, how people over 65, more and more of them are using technology in their lives, much more than 10 or 20 years ago, because these are people who have kind of growing up with it, and they were younger. So 20 years ago, someone who was 80 probably didn't have experience with something new, like Facebook or LinkedIn. But the people who have been using them for 20 years, who are now over 65, they're going to keep using them. So there are many older adults who use all sorts of social media. And so digital natives are people who are born into and live in the world of computers, cell phones, email, text messaging, social media, networking, all that. So it's people who are born into this. And there's actual research that shows that young people who are born into this world and who are using this actively, their brains are different. They have different neural connections. They think differently, they conceptualize differently. And there are many young people, as I mentioned before, who the way they communicate, the way they establish relationships, the way they maintain relationships is different than people who are not born into this. And if you ever have gone to the airport and look around, and it's like even the children, everyone's on an iPad or everyone's on an iPhone, everyone has a device. It's a different world we live in now than 15 or 20 years ago. And that will influence the work that we do professionally. The digital natives are all these native speakers of this digital native, of computers, video games, the internet, and all that. So, for example, years ago I remember saying, oh, you want to go to the movies? Great, I'll look in the paper and see what's playing. And someone looking at me saying, what do you mean? Just do Fandango or do the app. And now I have that app and I use it, and it no longer crosses my mind to look up a movie in the newspaper. Whereas maybe however many years ago, 7 years ago, that was alien to me. I was not a native speaker of this. And, if we looked at my iPhone, how many apps I have, and then some young people I know, they can have 30 or 40 apps that they use regularly, and how this is like part of their leisure time. This is how they have fun and interact and communicate. So even just how people access the news, or how they share information with their friends, and even how they meet virtually as opposed to physically in person. So again, being a digital native is different. And if you're not a digital native, if you're a digital immigrant, someone who wasn't born in this world, it is different. And assessing our clients' needs, their use of technology, how it's relevant in their lives, all that's relevant and important to the work that we do. Because as I said before, their expectations of us will be different. What they use in their personal life, frequently they'll plan to or hope to use in their professional role, which may be appropriate. It might not be. We might explain why we don't participate in social media with our clients, and we'll explain that, and that might be a surprise or shock. So one question Sarah asks is there any research that people who are digital immigrants, people who are older, can have their neural connections changed after a certain period of development? I haven't seen those studies, but I can just tell you this. It's a lot easier to learn a foreign language when you're really young and your brain is still developing, but adults learn foreign languages all the time. It's just maybe more challenging. It's not as easy, but people do it all the time. And as I described, my use of technology is very different than it was 5 to 7 years ago. So while I was a digital immigrant, I wasn't born into this, so I'm not a native speaker, I've learned a lot of the culture, and I've learned a lot of the language. I will acknowledge I don't use it as fully or to the extent as many young people I know, but just as we can learn a foreign language, we can certainly learn the culture and the language of the internet and of social media and all that. So this is a video that I'm hoping will come through. Oh, let me see, let me go back. I haven't tried it before. No, it's not going to work on here, unfortunately. So it's just highlighting the difference between a digital immigrant and a digital native. But if you want to on your own later, if you just wanted to type on if you search for it on Google, or just go to anything online to find it, you can type in monk learning to read a book, or monk learning to use a book, and it's just a fun little video that highlights what it's like learning new technology for the first time, being a digital immigrant. But this is just a cartoon in the nursery at the hospital. OMG, I just got born. So that's an extreme example of a digital native, someone who's born into this world of technology. And not all of us have been, and we have to learn it. And we might have somewhat of a mismatch between us and clients at times. And so, I would just say it's like a diversity issue, an individual differences issue to attend to. Nothing bad about it or wrong about it, but it's something that oftentimes people will. It's a part of their lives, and so it's something to deal with. Carrie asks, is it possible there'll be a time where we can't keep digital media out, and will traditional therapy be outdated? I don't know that it'll be outdated. I think there'll always be a place for it, but it highlights this issue of that we have to educate and inform our clients about the services that we provide, and we have to ensure that they understand the parameters and the ground rules of the professional relationship and how we provide services. I guess it's possible that in the future this will be one of those specialty areas, just like, so online counseling could be viewed as a specialty area, just as, prescriptive authority, prescribing medication is a specialty area, or treatment of eating disorders, or pediatric encopresis, or sleep disorders. I mean, there's loads of specialty areas, and just because one of us is not a specialist in that area doesn't mean we can't have a good, viable practice. And everyone does not need to integrate technology into their practice, except I would just say this: we all use some technology in our practices, so that's unavoidable. So you will use a telephone, at least administratively. You might have a website, and some websites now you can have your online scheduler, a calendar, so clients can make appointments directly. They can't see other people's names, they'll just see if a space or time spot is open or closed. And then you can have different forms and paperwork and stuff on your website that people can print out and read and download, and then bring into the next appointment, so to help with the informed consent process. So there's lots you can do that involves technology, but does everyone need to provide video conferencing services over the internet? No, not at all. And just like everyone's not a rural psychologist or a prison psychologist or a military psychologist, so there's lots of opportunities, but they're not requirements. The thing about a client who goes on vacation or goes on a business trip and has a crisis, I mean, I don't really view that as telehealth or telepsychology. I think we already do that with telephones, so that will continue. And if we wanted to do that using some other technology, that's okay. But we'll talk about a little more coming up now about social media, and you'll hear how you don't really need to participate in social media with your clients, and that's not necessarily something that's mandatory. So hopefully that answers that question. But again, many clients participate in social media in their lives. And as I mentioned, that's how they communicate, that's how they share information and keep in touch with friends and family. And so it's possible that many clients will want to continue that process with us. And that's a good thing, and it's a challenge. So this issue of receiving a friend request from a client is very challenging. I think it's the kind of issue that you want to have considered beforehand and have a policy. So we'll get to the social media policy in a little bit, but the idea that it's really important to know in advance what your comfort is. So clients can ask us anything they want. They can say, would you please not keep any records, or can you not put my name on it? They can ask anything. And we have the right to decline, and we have the right to not do something that makes us uncomfortable. So I think we have to understand, what does it mean to accept a friend request? So if I have a presence online with Facebook, and a client finds me on Facebook, and it's easy to find you if you're on there, doesn't matter what security settings or privacy settings you use, then it's an issue of, what am I comfortable giving my client access to? So if you're posting photos from your family trip, your vacation, and your kids, and all sorts of personal things that you share with friends, would you want your clients to have access to that? Would I share that kind of material or information with a client who I see in person? And if the answer is no, then why would I do it online? And typically the only reason is because it exists, because that's what I do in my personal life. That's how we share things. So many mental health professionals agree that you don't accept friend requests from current clients, and for many also even former clients. This gets into self-disclosure, transparency, just how much you want to be willing to share with clients. And you might think, well, I can use these privacy settings that like Facebook has. There's been a lot in the media about how confusing Facebook's privacy settings are. And the interesting thing is they keep changing them. and they're very confusing. So even if you use the highest level of privacy settings, not only can other people still find you typically, like clients, but the privacy settings are intended to limit users, people out there like clients or members of the public, friends, from accessing certain levels of information, certain types of information you have posted on your Facebook profile or your site. What it doesn't limit is Facebook's access to what you have posted. And it's really important to understand what their business model is. And I'm not singling out Facebook, it's all social media. They're in the business of making money. And if us participating in that social media site is free for us and free for the people we link with or connect with, how do they make their money? Frequently, it's because they're accessing our private personal information. They're accessing our address book in our computer. They're accessing all the connections we have, so anyone we're linked with, and they're using that for marketing purposes and selling to companies that purchase these data to market to us, to sell products. So as an example, in the past, I've received a number of requests through LinkedIn from current clients. And my clients know that I don't participate in any online social media, and if I receive a request from them, I will not respond to it, but I will discuss it with them at our next appointment. And so because I don't want them to just think I am just ignoring them, like I just delete it and that's the end of it. I let them know my policy, and then I mention it to them and discuss it. Every single time when I've received a request to join and connect with someone, a current client on LinkedIn, and I speak to them about it at the next appointment, they say to me, I never sent that to you. And they're surprised. LinkedIn sent it. I'm in their address book. If they've emailed me or if I've emailed them, LinkedIn knows, and Facebook knows, and MySpace knows, and all these sites. So there are privacy issues that we need to attend to if we're going to participate in social media and interact with clients. The privacy settings don't attend to or address that type of privacy issue. So the privacy settings or security settings are about consumers, friends and family and clients accessing what we post. In terms of the company that is the owner of the social media site, they use our information and they sell it. And if you've ever gone on Amazon, and like I'll go on Amazon and I looked at books about whatever it is, I then start getting emails about that stuff. Interestingly, so obviously I am participating here with TZK seminars. It's amazing. I never before received, when I went on the internet, never before saw an ad for TZK seminars. But then, since I've started doing these webinars, now I periodically, when I log in and just look for something online, and an ad pops up, it's one for TZK seminars. And I once looked up something about the MBA program here at Loyola, then all of a sudden I start getting these other school MBA program ads. So if you get ads that are targeted to you, how do they know how to target you? By having access to your data. And you might think, how is that possible? You authorized it. Anytime you participate in anything online, they'll have the user agreement. And I know we can't do a show of hands, but think about it. Who reads these user agreements? I've tried to read a couple. I'm not an attorney. I can't understand these things, and it's so long and so detailed. I just click on I agree. So I've agreed, and I'm sure I've signed away my rights, and they have access to all my data. And anytime we do anything online, that happens. So these are some things to pay attention to. The other interesting thing is, Sarah has written a comment about blogs, and also I'll just add to that listservs, professional listservs. These are not confidential. These are not private. And so while we might consult with a colleague, for example, on a professional listserv, I think you have to be really careful, very cautious about what level of identifying information we might share. So I want to be very broad and general. Typically, the rule to follow is if your client read what you're writing, could they identify that it's about them? So I'd be very cautious about these online forums. And then, do you have, I've had a colleague ask me this the other day about she has political opinions and wants to have a blog and address current political issues. And she wants to know if that's unethical. And my reaction was, it's not unethical, but anything that's online, you have to assume that current, former, or future clients may have access to. And you just have to be comfortable with that. So if I'm posting my strong political opinions online on a blog, someone can have access to that. I've regularly have clients who say, oh, I found you online. Like they get a referral from whomever, but then they Google search me and they say, oh, I saw you just presented at this conference, or I saw the video of your talk on this, or, it's like anything that goes online, clients can have access to. And they have done studies that many Americans use the internet as their primary source of healthcare related information. So that's not just for finding providers, it's also for getting health information. And so that's a little scary also because it's not vetted. So, consumers can be, making important life decisions about things they see online and it's not accurate. So like WebMD, I know many people use, and it's funded by the pharmaceutical industry. So do you think there might be a slant to the advice they give? So you have the right to do a blog. You have the right to post your political views online. In terms of what are the ethical ramifications, it's not an ethics issue really. It's self-disclosure. It's transparency. How much do you want the public to, to know about you? How private do you want to be? So if you're trying to stimulate getting a certain kind of client and not others, posting your political views online can be helpful for doing that. But I don't think it's unethical to have a blog. It's just only if you were to be sharing confidential information about clients, that's a different issue. But to just share your opinions and viewpoints, you have the right to do that. Keep in mind, anyone can access that, and it can have ramifications in terms of people learn about your opinions, about your views, things like that. So that's this issue of clinician transparency, self-disclosure, and how it might impact the treatment relationship. So to me, those are some things that you can think about and pay attention to. And I'll just say this, I don't view myself as the final arbiter on all ethics matters. I consult with colleagues fairly regularly when I face a dilemma and I'm not sure what to do. So I don't think like I have the absolute answers. I can say, here are some issues to consider. Here are some questions to ask. Here are some things to think about. And then we each have to then make our own decisions. But again, I like all the questions people are asking and all the comments and issues people are raising. I think it's terrific. So you have to consider what's the potential of declining or refusing a friend request or linking and joining online. So that's why I think it's good to have a policy in advance that you review with your clients from the outset so that it's not going to harm the relationship. They don't feel rejected. If you have a general policy and they know it up front, how they'll respond will be different than if it's never been talked about because you never thought of it, and then you get this request and you either decline or you just delete it and ignore it. So that can affect the treatment relationship. And then what's the effect of accepting the friend request and of how transparent you want to be, how much information, private personal information you want to share. I talked earlier about that boundary between personal and professional. Okay, this is a way to just knock that wall over. Would you invite a client into your home? Then why would you invite them to see all the photos that you post to your family and friends online? I mean, that's just an example of something to consider. Just looking at another question or comment here. So Karen mentions the idea of using an alias for Facebook. Some people do that, and then some people also, not an alias, but they'll just have like a professional Facebook profile and then a personal one and try to keep them separate. All I would say is sometimes clients can find your personal one. They're kind of good at finding us online. It's not a big deal. It's just whatever you're comfortable with. I just think these are issues I want you to consider. I'm not saying what you must do or should do or can't do or should never do. I just think because of the world we live in these days, these are things to think about, to make an informed decision of how you want to proceed. And then Celia mentioned she knows of a psychologist who was stalked online by the ex-husband of a client. Again, we could be stalked in real life too. I mean, I once had a client who told me, I drove past your house, each night this past week. Or I parked in front of your house and was just watching your house to see if I could see you. Okay, now we're getting to that scary, creepy zone. We need to address this as a treatment relationship. So the same can happen even if you're not on social media. I just think it makes it so much easier to happen if you have an online presence. You're so much more accessible. You're sharing so much more. And I just want you to consider that. So for digital natives, what they consider a real relationship might be different than what some of us consider real, that in-person relationship, because they might view all digital relationships as real. That's how they do it. And so we would just have to share what we're comfortable with and let them know. And for some people, it can be challenging to transition from the digital world to the in-person world. I have a colleague who was working with a young person, a young adult, an emerging adult, who shared about, I met this young woman online, and we've been texting each other, and we're sharing photos, and it's really great, and we're going to meet. And he happened to be out, and he saw his client with this other person, and they're both sitting at a table, like at a Starbucks or Panera or wherever, across from each other, looking down, texting each other. It's like, okay, there's something wrong with this picture here. There's a time for digital world, and there's a time for in-person, or what we'll call real world. And for some people, they're so used to living through the digital world that it might actually be hard to live in the real world, and that could be even a treatment issue then. So, as I've mentioned, it's important to have a social media or social networking policy. I think that's just good for all of us to have. And if you don't have any online presence, you don't do any technology, you let them know. And again, these are things to address in informed consent, and consider how you would respond to, if you do have an online presence, how you would respond to friend requests, and include that in your social media policy and in the discussion of informed consent. And as I've mentioned, I think it's good to discuss these things with clients at the next time you interact with them, should it arise. So I wouldn't just delete their request and not mention it, because that could have an impact then on the relationship. And I would just keep in mind, the idea of boundaries and multiple relationships, whether they're in person or online. You have to decide how comfortable you are with different boundary crossings. A crossing is not a violation. A crossing can be quite appropriate, and some of it can be cultural issues. Some of it can be our theoretical orientation. It could be the type of treatment. It could be personality characteristics, and just your personal comfort. But I wouldn't ignore or overlook these issues. I'd still pay attention to them. So self-disclosure does blur the line between personal and professional. My policy and my thinking on self-disclosure is it can be very appropriate if used in a clinically relevant and appropriate manner. So I have to ask, why am I considering self-disclosure, where I disclose my own thoughts or feelings or something about my life with a client in a session? So what are my motivations? What are my goals and objectives? Are there any options or alternatives reasonably available for achieving the same goal, not self-disclosing? What are the potential benefits of this self-disclosure? Is there anything about the client's treatment presentation, history, symptoms, whatever, that might contraindicate the self-disclosure? You know, am I motivated by my needs, like my need for closeness and sharing, or motivated by helping my client? So self-disclosure is a legitimate clinical intervention. But as you can hear, how you use it and when you use it and why and the extent of it are all issues that we each get to decide. Sharing photos online of my family vacation is very different than disclosing to a client who's struggling with an adolescent, that, when my kids were adolescents, I also had to struggle with whatever the issue is, and I found it very stressful and frustrating. But you really do get through that stage, and I didn't believe it at the time, but I did. It's just as an example of a possible self-disclosure. That's really different than sharing photos of your trip or things like that. So we've talked about security settings. Searching for client information online is really interesting, because what would you do with that information? Would you keep it a secret? Would you disclose, I secretly searched for you online and here's what I found out? So I know some people do this. I would be cautious about it. Even some employers and graduate schools even do that. And I think it's just important to disclose that up front, to let people know that you have the right to do that. Rebecca asks, are there ways we can use social media as a way to foster a therapeutic connection and relationship with digital natives, like teenagers? And I think the answer to that is an emphatic yes. And even if you personally don't participate in the social media, your client can bring in their iPad or laptop to a session in person with you, log on, and share with you what they have there. So it's very possible for them to share this very important part of their life with you. You're just not necessarily accepting a friend request from them and connecting online with them, because what's happening, so there's two forms of sharing that can take place. One is them sharing with you, and the other is you sharing with them. Them sharing with you is great. I've had clients who share their artwork with me, their writings or poetry, photos, all sorts of things with me. That's great. But I'm not necessarily sharing my personal private life and accomplishments and activities and hobbies and things like that with them. So have them bring it into the office and access it online live, and they show it to you. You can process it, discuss it. That's terrific. So I think that's something that can easily be done. I don't know that we have to necessarily participate in the social media with them and grant them that access to us, and then also take the risk that now their private information is getting accessed by the company, that the software that we're using. So I'd be just a little more cautious about that, but definitely we can utilize it. And then, so that's the next bullet point, and that's exactly what we were talking about. So perfect timing with that comment. And again, I would just say I don't search for clients online, but I've seen in the local newspaper where it's they can have an article, local teacher accused of child molestation. Well, that's out in the public, and if I just happen to be online and I see something about a client, again, what's the policy? My policy is if I see something online or anywhere, just learn something about a client, I will mention it to them at the next appointment. And I let them know that that's my policy. Do I need a policy about them searching for me online? No, the policy is about what I do. They have the right to look me up online and access anything that's up there. So one recommendation is for you to search for yourself online periodically, just so you know what's out there and what clients and potential clients might be finding. And sometimes if something is posted that's inaccurate, there are opportunities to correct it, although that's often hard to do. But like I might do a Google search and type in Jeffrey Barnett, Jeff Barnett, Jeffrey E. Barnett, Dr. Jeffrey Barnett, Jeffrey E. Barnett PsyD, PsyD ABPP, different combinations of how a client might search for me, and let me see what can I find. It's an interesting exercise if you've never tried it, even if it's not that there's anything inappropriate posted about you, but there are like Rate My Therapist kind of sites. You might want to know if someone's rated you and what they've had to say, or just what's the information that's out there. It's just good to monitor that. Just like you monitor your credit score, you might want to monitor your online profile. And then, again, should you participate in social media, social networking? Some people will have one profile, or Facebook, for example, for personal life, and then one for the professional life. And what they post on each one is quite different. You just have to be careful about who you grant access to your site. And then again, I would keep in mind the protection of your client's privacy. I know you might say it's implied informed consent if they send you a friend request, but they haven't read the user agreement, just like we haven't really read and understood the user agreement. So it's important to just pay attention to that. And it's true, as Sarah mentions, anyone can post something that's inaccurate or negative, and the question is, what can we do? And it's a challenge because you can't say, like if I have a client named John Smith who posts something online about me that's, and they might be lying. Like this is someone who didn't pay their bill, and I kept requesting that they pay it, and I provide them with like 4 free sessions, and then I had to cut them off, and they post a negative rating and lie saying that I refuse to see them even though they paid their bill. I can't violate that client or former client's privacy, their confidentiality. So I can't respond to a specific negative rating. The thing that tends to be recommended is you can make a general statement. You can say, if you want to go on that site at all, but you could say, I cannot comment on any specific posting or rating by any individuals. However, I can share that my policy in general is this, or the way I handle fees and financial arrangements is this. I mean, you can make a general statement. The other option, as some have recommended, is you can have others put positive ratings up. Now, what I wouldn't do is go to my current clients and say, could you please go ahead and put up a positive rating? I think that's a different issue. Now we're getting into ethics code standards on testimonial endorsements. But the hope is if you're providing good services and there are people providing ratings, if there's a negative one, the hope is there'd be positive ones also. And the only other thing I can suggest is a general statement, like I mentioned, because you can't violate your client's privacy, even if they're lying about you. You can't say, that's a lie. Here, I'm going to upload a video of our session so you can see what I do, or here's our informed consent agreement, or, you have to still protect their privacy, and they have the right to use the technology in a negative way. So it is possible to keep private and professional separate. It's a challenge, but it is definitely possible. We've talked about the use of security settings, and again, they provide some protection, but I think we just have to make sure clients really understand, what a client might be okay with in their personal life, they might not be okay with in this professional relationship, and we can explain why. So the safest thing is to just not participate in social media as a professional. What you do, your personal life is totally separate, but then you have to keep in mind who can have access to what, and you wouldn't want to let clients have access to what you're sharing with just your family and friends. But those are some things to think about, again. And we've talked about therapeutic uses of clients' social networking sites. They can bring it in, you can log on, access it in session. You can do that every session you want. That's a great use of it. So I think that's something we could let clients know is available. What's interesting is oftentimes clients don't know what's acceptable or possible. And so if we don't raise an issue, they might not bring it up. So for example, if you're very comfortable looking at their social networking sites, if they want to log on in your office, on their own computer, you can just mention that if you have a social media policy, you would include that in there, and it's reviewed as part of the informed consent. Now they know. But if we don't raise these issues, it's sort of not fair to the client, and then it's going to be ethically risky when something comes up, when it arises, and we aren't prepared for it. So I just think knowing what the basic issues are, thinking about them up front, seeing about having a policy, integrating it into your informed consent, having an open discussion with clients about these issues when they arise, those are just all good general recommendations that I can suggest. And we mentioned doing online searches. Again, I don't recommend that. I know some graduate programs and some employers do that. The thing I can just say to clients, about if they are going to be posting things online and it becomes a treatment issue is, what seemed like a good idea during spring break and junior year of college to post online might not seem so great when you're a senior and you're applying to grad school or applying to jobs and they look online. So, I think advising clients about what they post can be a helpful thing we can do as well. So in terms of ethics issues and dilemmas, so we've talked about boundaries and multiple relationships. So again, if you wouldn't accept an in-person friend request, I wouldn't accept an online one. As far as self-disclosure goes, again, keep in mind the therapeutic uses of self-disclosure. Also, there are different types of self-disclosure. There's inadvertent self-disclosure and intentional self-disclosure. So inadvertent, if you wear an engagement ring or a wedding band or religious attire or a crucifix or Star of David around your neck, or if you're pregnant and showing. There's all sorts of self-disclosure. Even if you have a strong accent, you're sharing something about yourself. If you put diplomas on your wall or have family photos, that kind of self-disclosure isn't really what we're talking about here. So therapeutic, intentional self-disclosure we mentioned, where you share something personal that you think would help the client therapeutically. And then the third form that we're really talking about of this therapist transparency is how much of your personal information and life do you want your client to have access to. So there's inadvertent self-disclosure that just exists all over the place. We can't avoid that. Then there's intentional therapeutic self-disclosure, and I've mentioned sort of a decision-making model or process of some things to consider to decide on that. And I'm not recommending that you must use self-disclosure or you never should. It's just like any other therapeutic technique. It may be appropriate, it may not. For some clients, or sometimes or not. But it's something to consider and just have a thoughtful process for decision-making. And then the transparency is really the bigger issue here. How much access do I want my clients to have to my private life? So, just as an example, years ago when my wife was expecting our first child, I had to share with clients that I was going to be out for a certain period of time. And what I didn't do is say, I can't tell you when, and I can't tell you why, but sometime soon, I'm going to be out for 2 weeks, and someone will let you know. Okay, handling it that way, how is that going to affect the treatment relationship and trust, for example? So I had to disclose, my wife and I are expecting, and I can't tell you exactly what the due date is because that can change, but we're planning on it being around March 28th, and I'm planning to take 2 weeks off, and here's what my proposed plan is for that 2-week period of time, and here are the options. And we would discuss, because I don't want to abandon my clients, and we're going to have coverage with a colleague and just how we would handle that. There's a little self-disclosure in there. Just like if I said, I'll be taking vacation, I'll be away August 1st through the 15th, here's the coverage arrangements, let's discuss it, and I'd want to let the client know up front so it's not, just springing on them. But so I had a family with young kids and a parent who I was working with. And when I came back from being out for my paternity leave, the first session, the three kids had a card for me that they all signed and a gift for my baby of a teddy bear. And so then the question is, oh, this is a boundary issue. Accepting a gift, that sounds bad. That sounds unethical. I know. I'll tell these three little kids, I'm sorry, I can't accept that gift. It's unethical. Yet that'll go over really well. So again, this idea of what was their intent? What's the likelihood that it's going to adversely impact the treatment relationship? What would be the likely effect of declining this gift? Which is more harmful, accepting it or declining it? What are my motivations in accepting it? Am I trying to get something from them, or is this more something they're trying to do to just be nice and say thank you for how you've helped us? There's this whole decision-making process that goes into it. What I didn't do is, and they said, oh, did you have a boy or a girl? And I said, oh, we had a little boy and everyone's healthy. And then I just moved on to our treatment issues. What I didn't do is say, oh, I videotaped the delivery. Here, let me show it to you. And here's all the photos. There's a boundary, there's a line. And I mean, that's maybe an extreme example, but it highlights we have to make these decisions. We have to make the decision about what boundaries do we want to enforce? What are we comfortable sharing and disclosing? When is some self-disclosure necessary? We can't avoid it. And how do we want to most appropriately handle it? So that's true for all our clinical work. I would just add that when you're using social media and you have an online presence, it adds another layer. It just makes it that much more complex. So these are just some things to think about and to attend to. The hope is that you're sharing clinically relevant and appropriate information with them. So again, and Elise makes the point that, with my example about this family, I don't want to act in a way that increases anxiety or that's harmful. If I have a client with dependency issues or anxiety, or they just formed a good relationship with me, disappearing for 2 weeks and not explaining it is harmful. So again, when I have a decision to make, what are my motivations and what's the likely outcome? Which of these two choices is going to be more likely to be helpful or harmful? So these are all just things to consider. It's not that there's always a right and a wrong answer. So this is from the APA Ethics Code, but it says multiple relationships that would not reasonably be expected to cause impairment or risk, exploitation, or harm are not unethical. So, and this is true for all the ethics codes for the mental health professions. Multiple relationships are not all unethical and inappropriate. Only those that hold a significant potential for exploitation and harm. So therefore, we need to use a decision-making process about the potential for exploitation, the potential for harm. Again, is it clinically relevant and appropriate for this client? So sometimes we'll engage in multiple relationships. Sometimes we won't. These are gray areas. These are dilemmas where we have to make our best decision. And again, it makes it clear that this only applies to our professional roles. But if you're going to have a professional role and a personal role or relationship with a client, that is a multiple relationship situation, and then you do want to seek guidance from your ethics code and engage in a decision-making process to help you decide if it's appropriate to engage in. Some multiple relationships are unavoidable. If I was in a rural, remote area, I might have to provide treatment to the teacher of my child's school or a person who lives in the same neighborhood. And that sort of stuff happens even if you're not in a rural or remote area. For years, I lived in a large neighborhood with over 1,000 homes, and I was in a swimming pool in the neighborhood one summer, and I'm playing with my kids and some their friends in the pool, and someone taps me on the shoulder, and I look around, and there's one of my child clients saying, "Hi, can I play too?" Is that unethical? Do I dive under and hide and pretend I didn't see them? That's probably a negative thing to do for that relationship. But again, what options and alternatives exist? So if I can avoid a multiple relationship, that's great. If it's engage in this multiple relationship or the person doesn't get any treatment, then I have to negotiate and navigate how to most appropriately engage in the multiple relationship. And in the literature, it talks about compartmentalizing roles and responsibilities. So I might be engaged in a multiple relationship, but I separate the roles. So if I'm providing psychotherapy to my child's principal at their school, on back to school night, I don't ask about my child's, I don't ask the client about if they did their homework assignment from treatment, or if they, how their anxiety's going, or I know there's a lot of people here tonight and you have to talk in front of the crowd. How are you doing? Are you practicing the relaxation skills? That would be inappropriate. That's violating that boundary. It's not compartmentalizing. Or when I have a treatment session with my client and say, my son got an A- on that paper, and I know that was A work. In fact, I helped him with it. That's not compartmentalizing. We have to separate the roles. So there are times when multiple relationships are unavoidable, and we have to be reasonable and rational and realistic about it. But accepting friend requests, you have an option. You don't need to do that. And again, keep in mind of how much transparency do you want to have? How much information do you want to share? So self-revealing is sharing personal information about yourself. Self-involving is more of what we call immediacy, like a personal reaction. If I share, I really find myself feeling increasingly frustrated as you're speaking right now. And that's sort of like I'm sharing a countertransferential reaction. I'm disclosing something about what I'm experiencing, but it's purely for a therapeutic purpose. Self-revealing, like family photos, vacation plans, all that level of detail, that's a little different. And so again, we've talked about the deliberate versus unavoidable, so those are things to pay attention to. And then accidental, that just happens. So, you can have what's called an incidental contact with a client where you just happen to run into them in public. In the rural literature, basically, it's talked about that you would want to include in your informed consent how your client would like to be greeted or not greeted should you run into each other in different public settings, as well as what's your typical policy. So if my policy is I always wait to see if a client says hello first, I don't initiate it in public, and here's why, because it's as a respect issue. And a client might say, oh no, that's fine, I don't care who knows, I tell everyone that I'm seeing you. That's their right, that's their prerogative. But I had a situation once where I ran into a client in public, and I walked into say like a Panera, and saw him and walked over and started to say hello, and he immediately went like, no, don't say hello to me. That he was with someone and didn't want the psychologist greeting him. So we have to defer to our client's comfort, but even this is an informed consent issue. And again, inappropriate self-disclosures if it's done for our own benefit or if it's likely to be harmful to the client. And I do think for some clients, knowing too much personal or private information about ourselves and our own personal lives can be harmful to them, can be unhealthy. And so having some boundaries in place can be important. And again, you want to consider your theoretical orientation and treatment approach, but these are good things to think about. So, again, I know there's a YouTube video of me at an APA convention that's posted online that I saw when I did a search for myself. It's fine, it's no big deal. It's just something that was posted at an APA convention when they were interviewing different psychologists there. But if I post on YouTube my family reunion, so that's different than a privacy setting on a Facebook page. YouTube, that's open to anyone. So what if I do a training video? And I have a colleague who gave a workshop recently, and it wasn't videotaped, but someone in the audience videotaped it on their phone and then posted it online. And the psychologist was very upset that that was done because it was for a professional audience and not for the public, not for the lay public. But again, you have to decide, what are you comfortable posting online? How much transparency? These are things to be deliberate about. So again, we've talked that this is a boundary issue. So for boundaries, they can be avoided, crossed, or violated. So avoiding means you don't transgress or traverse the boundary at all, like 0 self-disclosure. Well, that's impossible. I've already explained that there's inadvertent self-disclosure. Crossing means you're going across the boundary, but doing so in a clinically appropriate, therapeutic, acceptable manner, acceptable ethically and acceptable to the client. Violating a boundary means it's contraindicated clinically, it has a high potential for exploitation or harm to the client, it's unethical, violates a code, things like that. So again, is it clinically appropriate or relevant? Is it part of a documented treatment plan? Meaning if you wanted to keep it secret, it's probably not a good idea. Is it relevant to the client's clinical needs and treatment goals? Is it consistent with prevailing professional practice standards? And again, consult if you're unsure. These are all things to consider. So you can post things online. Consider what are the costs and benefits, as best you can tell, just think about it. Is it a potential clients might be negatively impacted by it or affected by it? So that's something to consider. And how might this affect your relationship with clients? I know for a fact people can access information about us online. They can research us and find things out. You have to personally decide, do you want to add to that? How much do you want available to clients? And this might go back to that earlier question about having a political blog and things like that. You want to consider your credibility personally as a professional, and then the credibility of our profession, the public's trust in our profession, whether it's psychology, counseling, social work, whatever it might be. So, your online presence does impact how the public views you personally and mental health professionals in general. So that's something to consider as well. Again, we all have the right to post anything we want, but these are some factors and considerations just to think about. So again, you do want to make thoughtful decisions about all the things we've discussed. Consider some form of restrictions to your online profile, like a private or friend-only access, or use a pseudonym. Keep in mind, anything you share online can be shared with others, and people can forward it. So you can post something online, then delete it. Someone can take a screenshot. Someone can forward it. So once you've posted it, typically you've lost the ability to control it. So again, prevention being the key, we want to think about, should I post this or not? Excuse me. So these are some things we've already mentioned. I want to, in the interest of time, go to things that we haven't mentioned yet, since I've shared lots of information that are included in the slides already. So I'm not ignoring anything. We've just already discussed some of these. So such as using decision-making and consultation. So this is my colleague Keely Combs's website, and she has a social media policy, several technology policies, and she's made it very clear she's delighted to have anyone go to her website, access our policies, download them, change them, and use them. She and I actually published an article on the ethics issues, ethics, legal, and clinical issues in mental health that's easily accessible online if you're interested. But her website is a great resource, and she does have a social media policy, and everyone is welcome to use it, modify it, change it for your own use, post it on your website, share with clients, and so on. We also want to pay attention to HIPAA, so and other policies and guidelines. But so, for example, Skype is not HIPAA compliant. So if you want to use video conferencing software, when you search for them online, just do an online search for HIPAA compliant video conferencing software. Loads of them will show up. HIPAA compliant emailing or texting. There's so many forms of software that are out there. This is about electronic health records. Oops, I just deleted all your files. Can you repeat everything you ever told me? And so this highlights just anything you do, you want to back up. So if you've ever been working on a report and then all of a sudden you lose it, you know the frustration of not backing things up. So to have an external hard drive or the ability to back up into the cloud. And again, these are things that you can easily learn about. Just type it in online. There's a YouTube video for everything, and you can learn how to back up your files in a secure manner. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I just want to highlight all the information breaches that occur at hospitals, medical centers, clinics, health insurance companies. There are so many breaches that occur. And so electronic health records are amazing in some ways, but they also cause all sorts of security nightmares. And so I just share some of these here just to give you an idea of it. A lot of the problems have to do with not keeping the security settings up to date and human error. So bringing a laptop home that has secure information and losing the laptop, or losing a flash drive, or accessing the internet inappropriately and someone else having access to it, posting confidential client information on your website. I'm not making any of these up. They've all happened already repeatedly, and these are things to pay attention to. So here's one. Yahoo says 1 billion user accounts were hacked. Healthcare sector gets a near failing grade on cybersecurity. Mobile phone firmware that transmitted personally identifiable information without user consent or disclosure. And this gets into the user agreement and reading it. Just because software exists and is helpful in some ways doesn't mean we're not taking privacy risks. And this was massive data breach hits U.S. healthcare insurer. 3.7 consumers warned data may have been stolen, and then they'll respond by, they have to inform you, because if they have to be HIPAA compliant, they have to notify you of this potential breach, and then typically they'll pay for 1 or 2 years of free credit service monitoring. But that doesn't help you if your Social Security number has been accessed inappropriately. So for security purposes, there's different backup storage sites. These are some of the more widely used ones, and the same thing for encryption. I'm not endorsing any of these products. All you have to do is an online search of, HIPAA compliant storage in the cloud. You'll see all the ones that come up. Each of them will have a free version, and then if you want to have multiple users or multiple sites, and it's more complex, then you can purchase it. But for one person, the vast majority of them have a free version as well. But again, I would want to read reviews of them. They're not all created equally. And in terms of how do we do encryption, for example, encrypting my email, you can do HIPAA compliant email encryption software and see what comes up, and here are some of them. You can also encrypt your hard drive so that if you lose your laptop, for example, or your iPad, even your cell phone, and someone finds it, they won't be able to get access into it. You can even have with an iPhone, for example, where you can, if you lose it, you can search for it online and find it, and you can disable it and even wipe the hard drive. Wiping the hard drive is where it's basically random characters printed on every single spot or bit of information in the hard drive. To just delete something doesn't do that. So the idea of security is something we should take very seriously. As I mentioned earlier, keep your security settings in place, update your software. If you do back things up, which is important to do, make sure it's HIPAA compliant and secure, and use encryption when possible. And then for mobile device security, these are some recommendations that are given. And so again, one is install and enable encryption to protect health information stored or sent by mobile devices. So mobile devices can be your phone, your iPad, your laptop, anything that you use. And then use a password or other user authentication. And your password really has to be a serious password. You don't want to have it like Jeff's password is not a good password. You want capital letters, lowercase letters, numbers, symbols, and it shouldn't be something that's easily identifiable. So if I went to Syosset High School and our team was the Braves, I don't want to put Syosset Braves 75. That's not a good password. If it's capital X, lowercase b, pound sign, question mark, X437, that's a better password. So then the issue is, how do I remember all my passwords? So there are, in the cloud, these online safes or storage facilities that you can use where you just have to remember the password to open the safe, and then all your others are stored in there. But you don't want to put your password on a Post-it on your monitor of your computer. I mean, that defeats the purpose. So you want to have good passwords. And there are what are called bots, which are these computer programs that are out there just running random digits and characters trying to break into your computer. And so the more complex a password, the better. They also have other user authentication, which is like you can have a password and your thumbprint, or there are double or dual layer authentication where there's an app that you click on the app on your smartphone. It gives you a randomly generated 5-digit number that you have to type in onto your computer, and then once you do that, then you can do your password, and that number is only good for 30 seconds. And so at Loyola we have that. So it's a dual level of authentication. You have to just decide personally how much you want to do, and how carried away with this you want to get, but you want to have some safeguards in place. So this idea of wiping and remote disabling software is if you do lose the device. So to just, like if you're going to get a new laptop and you just delete things, it's still there. It's in the hard drive. Deleting doesn't do anything. You have to download software to wipe the hard drive. And so to be able to remote disable, to actually erase all the data, is really important. And they recommend disabling and not installing or using file sharing applications, because if you're sharing files, you've just opened up your entire hard drive to share anything that's in there. And if you have anything that's confidential, people will have access to it now. And then I've already mentioned this before, but firewall, virus, and malware protection is just not only important to download and use, but to keep updating, keep them up to date. And this is for all security application. And when using apps, you want to research them first and make sure they're legitimate, they've been evaluated, that they don't include these backdoors so that now your whole computer is accessible to others inappropriately. And something as simple as maintain physical control of your mobile device. Don't like leave your cell phone on your desk when you go out to lunch. Keep it with you. And again, just in case you might lose it, you want to have it set so that if you haven't used it for 30 seconds, then you have to re-input your password, and you have, again, the ability to remotely locate it and to disable it. Those are all very important. And this next one, number 10, is so important. Only use secure Wi-Fi networks. So if it's a public Wi-Fi network, such as Starbucks or Panera or the airport or Barnes & Noble's or wherever, if it's a free Wi-Fi, anyone can access it. You should never access, like, let's say you have an app for your bank account or for your investments, or you communicate with clients using this device. You would want to only use a secure password protected network. So if you have Verizon or whatever the other company is and you have to log on and use a password to access your internet, then that's fine. But if it's free and unsecure, I would just recommend great caution about what information you share and what sites you access, because there may be others able to access it simultaneously. And then obviously, if you're going to get rid of a device, not only do you just delete, but you have to wipe the hard drive clean. And so this gives the link for these pieces of information and how to access more. The question was also raised of Dr. Keely Combs's website. So even if you just Google her, Keely, K-E-E-L-Y, Combs, K-O-L-M-E-S. But she has loads of resources and materials on her website that hopefully you could use. And I'm just looking to see if there's any other questions people might have posted before we wrap up in the interest of time. letting them know about your pending trial is appropriate so clients don't get anxious and you just disappear. Great. So in addition to what I have posted here, I have any reference that I listed. I've included them here, including web links, so you can easily follow up on any of the things that are included in the PowerPoint. And I've checked the links, so they should all work. Although there's no guarantee, obviously online people do sometimes change their links, but I've recently checked, so they should all work fine. And then and I just clicked on one, so let me get out of that. So I have all those, and then I just have the last two slides just to go over with you. So this one is just about TZK seminars, and obviously you've already gone to their website to have to log in, and you have on your dashboard access to download my PowerPoint and the article that I mentioned about the different apps. And then obviously of significant importance for most of you will be the whole issue of your CE certificate, that I'm sure while this is a great topic and you're interested in learning, and I'm hoping this is a good experience for everyone, at the same time you want to be able to get your CE certificate. So you would go to the website, you would sign in using your email address and password, and then there's a 20-question multiple choice test that I prepared that the instructions I was given was anyone who's participated in this webinar should be able to answer all the questions easily. So it's nothing tricky or anything like that. And so you'd have to, if you get 100%, just pass the post test, and then you can then download your CE certificate. So obviously, if there are any issues, challenges, questions, or concerns about any of those technical matters, you can go on the website and email them. And I know they're very good about responding quickly. So hopefully, if you have a question, they'll take care of that. I just wanted to thank all of you for participating today. I hope this has been helpful to you and a good, useful webinar. And that you've, again, my focus is not on being the expert and telling you what to do or what not to do, but just supplying information that's timely and relevant, giving you things to think about and consider, and some ideas for how to move forward as you consider what your online presence will be, how to integrate different technologies into your practice administratively and clinically, and how to provide telehealth services if you want to. So I do hope that this has met your continuing education needs in that regard, and I thank you all for participating. And since there are, I see lots of people saying thank you, so thank you all very much. I very much appreciate your comments and feedback. And I'm going to sign off now, and so I wish you all the best, and thank you so much. Take care. Bye.